Chapter 16. At the time he had been much too excited and flustered to answer anything, but as the next 12 months went by, he learned that being a millionaire was quite pleasant indeed. There were headaches, of course. There was the initial headache of signing his name several hundred times in the course of the transfer of Hawk's wealth to him. There were also the frequent visits from the tax collectors and the payments to them of a sum that staggered Alan to think about, in the name of rotation tax. But even after taxes, legal fees, and other expenses, Alan found he owned better than 900,000 credits, and the estate grew by investment every day. The court appointed a legal guardian for him, the lawyer Jesperson, who was to administer Alan's money until Alan reached the biological age of 21. The decision was an involved one, since Alan had undeniably been born 300 years earlier in 3576, but the robo-judge that had presided over that particular hearing cited a precedent 700 years old, which stated that for legal purposes a Starman's biological and not his chronological age was to be accepted. The guardianship posed no problems for Alan, though. When he met with Jesperson to discuss future plans, the lawyer told him, "You can handle yourself, Alan. I'll give you free rein with the estate, with the proviso that I have veto power over any of your expenditures until your 21st birthday." That sounded fair enough. Alan had reason to trust the lawyer. Hadn't Hawks recommended him? "I agree to that," said Alan. "Suppose we start right now. I'd like to take a year and travel around the world. As my legal guardian, you'll be stuck with the job of managing my estate and handling my investments for me." Jesperson chuckled. "You'll be twice as wealthy when you get back. Nothing makes money so fast as money." Alan left the first week in December, having spent 3 weeks doing virtually nothing but sketching out his itinerary. There were plenty of places he intended to visit. There was London, where James Hudson Cavour had lived and where his hyperdrive research had been carried out. There was the Lexman Institute of Space Travel in Zurich, where an extensive library of space literature had been accumulated. It was possible that hidden away in their files was some stray notebook of Cavour's, some clue that would give Alan a lead. He wanted to visit the area in Siberia that Cavour had used as his testing ground, and from which the last bulletin had come from the scientist before his unexplained disappearance. But it was not only a business trip. Alan had lived nearly half a year in the squalor of Hasbrook, and because of his free status he would never be able to move into a better district despite his wealth. But he wanted to see the rest of Earth. He wanted to travel just for the sake of travel. Before he left, he visited a rare book dealer in York City, and for an exorbitant 50 credits purchased a 5th edition copy of An Investigation into the Possibility of Faster-than-Light Space Travel by James H. Cavour. He had left his copy of the work aboard the Valhalla, along with the few personal possessions he had managed to accumulate during his life as a starman. The book dealer had frowned when Alan asked for the volume under the title he knew, The Cavour Theory. "I don't think... wait." He vanished for perhaps 5 minutes and returned with an old, fragile, almost impossibly delicate-looking book. Alan took it and scanned the opening page. There were the words he had read so many times. "The present system of interstellar travel is so grossly inefficient as to be virtually inoperable on an absolute level." "Yes, that's the book. I'll take it." His first stop on his round-the-globe jaunt was London, where Cavour had been born and educated more than 13 centuries before. The Stratoliner made the trip across the Atlantic in a little less than 3 hours. It took a half-hour more by overshoot from the airport to the heart of London. Somehow, from Cavour's few autobiographical notes, Alan had pictured London as a musty town, picturesque, reeking of medieval history. He couldn't have been more wrong. Sleek towers of plastic and concrete greeted him. Overshoots roared by at the tops of the buildings. A busy network of bridges connected them. He went in search of Cavor's old home in Bayswater with the nebulous idea of finding some important document wedged in the woodwork. But the local security officer shook his head as Alan asked for directions. "Sorry, lad, I've never heard of that street. Why don't you try the information robot up there?" The information robot was a blocky, green-skinned synthetic planted in a kiosk in the middle of a broad, well-paved street. Alan approached and gave the robot Cavor's 13th-century-old address. "There is no record of any such address in the current files," the steely voice informed him. "No, it's an old address. It dates back to at least 2570. A man named Cavor lived there." The robot digested the new data. Relays hummed softly within it as it scanned its memory banks. Finally it grunted, "Data on the address you seek has been reached." "Fine. Where's the house?" "The entire district was demolished during the general rebuilding of London in 2982 to 2997. Nothing remains." "Oh," said Alan. The London trail trickled out right then and there. He pursued it a little further, managing to find Cavor's name inscribed on an honor roll of the impressive London Technological Institute for the year 2529, and discovered a copy of Cavor's book in the Institute library. There was nothing else to be found. After a month in London, Alan moved on eastward across Europe. Most of it was little like the descriptions he had read in the Valhalla's library. The trouble was that the starship's visits to Earth were always at least a decade behind, usually more. Most of the library books had come aboard when the ship had first been commissioned, far back in the year 2731. The face of Europe had almost totally altered since then. Now shiny new buildings replaced the ancient houses which had endured for as much as 1,000 years. A gleaming bridge linked Dover and Calais. Elsewhere, the rivers of Europe were bridged frequently, providing easy access between the many states of the Federation of Europe. Here, there, monuments of the past remained. The Eiffel Tower, absurdly dwarfed by the vast buildings around it, still reared its spidery self in Paris, and Notre Dame still remained as well. But the rest of Paris, the ancient city Alan had read so much of, that had long since been swept under by the advancing centuries. Buildings did not endure forever. In Zurich he visited Lexman Institute for Space Travel, a magnificent group of buildings erected on the royalties from the Lexman space drive. A radiant statue 60 feet high was the monument to Alexander Lexman, who in 2337 had first put the stars within the reach of man. Alan succeeded in getting an interview with the current head of the Institute, but it was anything but a satisfactory meeting. It was held in an office ringed with mementos of the epoch-making flight of 2338. "I'm interested in the work of James H. Cavor," Alan said almost immediately, and from the bleak expression that appeared on the scientist's face, he knew he had made a grave mistake. "Cavor is as far from Lexman as possible, my friend. Cavor was a dreamer, Lexman a doer." "Lexman succeeded, but how do you know Cavor didn't succeed as well?" "Because, my young friend, faster-than-light travel is flatly impossible. A dream, a delusion." "You mean that there's no faster-than-light research being carried on here?" "The terms of our charter set down by Alexander Lexman himself specify that we are to work toward improvements in the technique of space travel. It is nothing about fantasies and daydreams. No, hyperdrive research is taking place at this institute, and none will take place so long as we remain true to the spirit of Alexander Lexman." Alan felt like crying out that Lexman was a bold and daring pioneer, never afraid to take a chance, never worried about expense or public reaction. It was obvious, though, that the people of the Institute had long since fossilized in their patterns. It was a waste of breath to argue with them. Discouraged, he moved on, pausing in Vienna to hear the opera. Max had always intended to spend a vacation with him in Vienna, listening to Mozart, and Alan felt he owed it to Hawks to pay his respects. The operas he saw were ancient, medieval in fact, better than 2,000 years old. He enjoyed the tinkly melodies, but found some of the plots hard to understand. He saw a circus in Ankara, a football game in Budapest, a nullgrav wrestling match in Moscow. He journeyed to the far reaches of Siberia, where Cavour had spent his final years, and found that what had been a bleak wasteland suitable for spaceship experiments in 2570 was now a thriving modern city of 5 million people. The site of Cavour's camp had long since been swallowed up. Alan's faith in the enduring nature of human endeavor was restored somewhat by his visit to Egypt, for there he saw the pyramids, nearly 7,000 years old. They looked as permanent as the stars. The first anniversary of his leaving the Valhalla found him in South Africa. From there he traveled eastward through China and Japan, across the highly industrialized islands of the far Pacific, and from the Philippines he returned to the American mainland by jet express. He spent the next 4 months traveling widely through the United States, gaping at the Grand Canyon and the other scenic preserves of the West. East of the Mississippi, life was different. There was barely a stretch of open territory between York City and Chicago. It was late in November when he returned to York City. Jesperson greeted him at the airfield, and they rode home together. Alan had been gone a year. He was past 18 now, a little heavier, a little stronger. Very little of the wide-eyed boy who had stepped off the Valhalla the year before remained intact. He had changed inwardly. But one part of him had not changed, except in the direction of greater determination. That was the part that hoped to unlock the secret of faster-than-light travel. He was discouraged. His journey had revealed the harsh fact that nowhere on Earth was research into hyperdrive travel being carried on. Either they had tried and abandoned it as hopeless, or, like the Zurich people, they had condemned the concept from the start. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Jesperson asked. Alan slowly shook his head. "Not a hint, and I really covered ground." He stared at the lawyer a moment. "How much am I worth now?" "Well, offhand," Jesperson thought for a moment, "say $1,300,000. I've made some good investments this past year." Alan nodded. "Good. Keep the money piling up. I may decide to open a research lab of my own, and we'll need every credit we've got." But the next day an item arrived in the morning mail which very much altered the character of Alan's plans for the future. It was a small but thick package, neatly wrapped, which bore as return address the name Dwight Bentley, with a London number. Alan frowned for a moment, trying to place the name. Then it came back to him. Bentley was the vice provost of the London Institute of Technology, Cavour's old school. Alan had had a long talk with Bentley one afternoon in January, about Cavour, about space travel, and about Alan's hopes for developing a hyperspace drive. The parcel was the right size and thickness to contain a book. Alan slit the fastenings and folded back the outer wrapper. A note from Bentley lay on top. London, 3rd November, 3877. My dear Mr. Donnell, perhaps you may remember the very enjoyable chat you and I had one day at this institute last winter, on the occasion of your visit to London. You were, I recall, deeply interested in the life and work of James H. Cavour, and anxious to carry on the developments he had achieved in the field of space travel. Several days ago, in the course of an extensive resurveying of the Institute's archives, the enclosed volume was discovered very thoroughly hidden in the dusty recesses of our library. Evidently Mr. Cavour had forwarded the book to us from his laboratory in Asia, and it had somehow become misfiled. I am taking great liberty of forwarding the book on to you, in the hopes that it will aid you in your work and perhaps ultimately bring you success. Would you be kind enough to return the book to me, care of this Institute, when you are finished with it? Cordially, Dwight Bentley. Alan let the note slip to the floor as he reached for the enclosed book. It was leather-bound and even more fragile than the copy of the Cavour theory he had purchased. It looked ready to crumble at a hostile breath. With mounting excitement, he lifted the ancient cover and turned it over. The first page was blank. So were the second and third. On the fourth page, Alan saw a few lines of writing in an austere, rigid hand. He peered close and with awe and astonishment read the words written there. The Journal of James Hudson Cavour, Volume 16, January 8 to October 11, 2570. Chapter 17. The old man's diary was a curious and fascinating document. Alan never tired of poring over it, trying to conjure up a mental image of the queer, plucky fanatic who had labored so desperately to bring the stars close to earth. Like many embittered recluses, Cavour had been an enthusiastic diarist. Everything that took place in his daily life was carefully noted down, his digestion, the weather, any stray thoughts that came to him, tart observations on humanity in general. But Alan was chiefly interested in the notations that dealt with his researches on the problem of a faster-than-the-speed-of-light space drive. Cavour had worked for years in London, harried by the reporters and mocked by scientists. But late in 2569, he had sensed he was on the threshold of success. In his diary for January 8, 2570, he wrote, "The Siberian site is almost perfect. It has cost me nearly what remains of my savings to build it, but out here I will have the solitude I need so much. I estimate 6 months more will see completion of my pilot model. It is a source of deep bitterness in me that I am forced to work on my ship like a common laborer, when my part should have ceased 3 years ago with the development of my theory and the designing of my ship. But this is the way the world wants it, and so shall it be." On May 8 of that year. Today there was a visitor, a journalist no doubt. I drove him away before he could disturb me, but I fear he and others will be back. Even in the bleak Siberian steppes I shall have no privacy. Work is moving along smoothly, though somewhat behind schedule. I will be lucky to complete my ship before the end of the year. On August 17. Planes continue to circle my laboratory here. I suspect I'm being spied on. The ship is nearing completion. It will be ready for standard Lexman drive flights any day now, but the installation of my space warp generator will take several months more. On September 20. Interference has become intolerable. For the 5th day an American journalist has attempted to interview me. My secret Siberian laboratory has apparently become a world tourist attraction. The final circuitry on the space warp generator is giving me extreme difficulties. There are so many things to perfect. I cannot work under these circumstances. I have virtually ceased all machine work this week. And on October 11, 2570. There is only one recourse for me. I will have to leave Earth to complete the installation of my generator. The prying fools and mockers will not leave me alone, and nowhere on Earth can I have the needed solitude. I shall go to Venus, uninhabited, uninhabitable. Perhaps they will leave me alone for the month or two I need to make my vessel suitable for interstellar drive. Then I can return to Earth, show them what I have done, offer to make the demonstration flight to Rigel and back in days. Perhaps... Why is it that Earth so tortures its few of original mind? Why has my life been one unending persecution, ever since I declared there was a way to shortcut through space? There are no answers. The answers lie deep within the dark recesses of the human collective soul, and no man may understand what takes place there. I am content to know that I shall have succeeded despite it all. Some day a future age may remember me, like Copernicus, like Galileo, as one who fought upstream successfully. The diary ended there, but in the final few pages were computations, a trial orbit to Venus, several columns of blast-off figures, statistics on the geographical distribution of the Venusian land masses. Cavour had certainly been a peculiar bird, Alan thought. Probably half the persecutions he complained of had existed solely inside his own fevered brain. But that hardly mattered. He had gone to Venus. The diary that had found its way back to the London Institute of Technology testified to that. And there was only one logical next step for Alan. Go to Venus. Follow the orbit Cavour had scribbled at the back of his diary. Perhaps he might find the Cavour ship itself. Perhaps the site of his laboratory, some notes, anything at all. He could not allow the trail to trickle out here. He told Jesperson, "I want to buy a small spaceship. I'm going to Venus." He looked at the lawyer expectantly and got ready to put up a stiff argument when Jesperson started to raise objections. But the big man only smiled. "Okay," he said. "When are you leaving?" "You aren't going to complain? The kind of ship I have in mind costs at least 200,000 credits. "I know that. But I've had a look at Cavour's diary, too. It was only a matter of time for you to decide to follow the old duck to Venus, and I'm too smart to think that there's any point of putting up a battle. Let me know when you've got your ship picked out, and I'll sit down and write the check." But it was not as simple as all that. Alan shopped for a ship. He wanted a new one, as long as he could afford it. And after several months of comparative shopping, and getting advice from the spaceport men, he picked the one he wanted. It was a sleek, glossy, 80-foot job, a Spacemaster 3878 model, equipped with Lexman converters and conventional ion jets for atmosphere flying. Smooth, streamlined, it was a lovely sight as it stood at the space field in the shadow of the great starships. Alan looked at it with pride, a slender, dark green needle yearning to pierce the void. He wandered around the spaceport and heard the fuelers and the oilers discussing it in reverent tones. "That's a mighty fine piece of ship, that green one out there. Some lucky fella's got it." Alan wanted to go over to them and tell them, "That's my ship. Me, Alan Donnell." But he knew they would only laugh. Tall boys not quite 19 did not own late-model Starmasters with price tags of 225,000 credits. He itched to get off planet with it, but there were more delays. He needed a flight ticket first, and even though he had had the necessary grounding in astrogation technique and space piloting as an automatic part of his education aboard the Valhalla, he was rusty, and he needed a refresher course that took 6 weary months. After that came the physical exams and the mental checkups and everything else. Alan fumed at the delay, but he knew it was necessary. A spaceship, even a small private one, was a dangerous weapon in unskilled hands. An out-of-control spaceship that came crashing to Earth at high velocity could kill millions. The shock wave might flatten 50 square miles. So no one was allowed up in a spaceship of any kind without a flight ticket, and you had to work to win your ticket. It came through finally, in June of 3879, a month after Alan's 20th birthday. By that time he had computed and recomputed his orbit to Venus 100 different times. 3 years had gone by since he had last been aboard a spaceship, and that had been the Valhalla. His childhood and adolescence now seemed like a hazy dream to him, far in the back of his mind. The Valhalla, with his father and Steve and all the friends of his youth aboard, was 3 years out from Earth, with 7 years yet to go before it reached Procyon, its destination. Of course, the crew had experienced only about 4 weeks, thanks to the Fitzgerald contraction. To the Valhalla people, only a month had passed since Alan had left them, while he had gone through 3 years. He had grown up in those 3 years. He knew where he was heading now, and nothing frightened him. He understood people. And he had one great goal which was coming closer and closer with each passing month. Blastoff Day was the 5th of September, 3879. The orbit Alan finally settled on was a 6-day trip, at low acceleration, across the 40 million odd miles that separated Earth from Venus. At the spaceport he handed in his flight ticket for approval, placed a copy of his intended orbit on file with central routing registration, and got his field clearance. The ground crew had already been notified that Alan's ship was blasting off that day, and they were busy now putting her in final departure condition. There were some expressions of shock as Alan displayed his credentials to the ground chief, and climbed upward into the control chamber of the ship he had named the James Hudson Cavour, but no one dared question him. His eyes caressed the gleaming furnishings of the control panel. He checked with the central tower, and was told how long till his blastoff clearance, and rapidly surveyed the fuel meters, the steering jet response valves, the automatic pilot. He worked out a tape with his orbit on it. Now he inserted it into the receiving tray of the autopilot and tripped a lever. The tape slid into the computer, clicking softly and emitting a pleasant hum. 8 minutes to blastoff, came the warning. Never had 8 minutes passed so slowly. Alan snapped on his view screen and looked down at the field. The ground crewmen were busily clearing an area as blastoff time approached. 1 minute to blastoff, Pilot Donnell. Then the countdown began, second by second. At the 10 seconds to go announcement, Alan activated the autopilot and nudged the button that transformed his seat into a protective acceleration cradle. His seat dropped down, and Alan found himself stretched out, swinging gently back and forth in the protective hammock. The voice from the control tower droned out the remaining seconds. Tensely, Alan waited for the sharp blow of acceleration. Then the roaring came, and the ship jolted from side to side, struggling with gravity for a moment, and then sprang up, free from the earth. Some time later came the sudden thunderous silence as the jets cut out. There was the dizzying moment of free fall, followed by the sound of the lateral jets imparting longitudinal spin to the small ship. Artificial gravity took over. It had been a perfect takeoff. Now there was nothing to do but wait for Venus to draw near. The days trickled past. Alan experienced alternating moods of gloom and exultation. In the gloomy moods he told himself this trip to Venus was a fool's errand, that it would just be another dead end, that Cavour had been a paranoid madman, and the hyperspace drive was an idiot's dream. But in the moments of joy, he pictured the finding of Cavour's ship, the building of a fleet of hyperdrive vessels, the distant stars within an almost instantaneous reach. He would tour the galaxies as he had 2 years ago toured Earth. Canopus and Deneb, Rigel and Procyon, he would visit them all, from star to bright star, from one end of the universe to the other. The shining oval of Venus grew brighter and brighter. The cloud layer that enveloped Earth's sister planet swirled and twisted. Venus was virtually an unknown world. Earth colonies had been established on Mars and on Pluto, but Venus, with her harsh formaldehyde atmosphere, had been ignored. Uninhabited, uninhabitable, the planet was unsuitable for colonization. The ship swung down into the cloud layer. Floating wisps of gray vapor streamed past the orbiting Cavor. Finally Alan broke through, navigating now on manual, following as best he could Cavor's old computations. He guided the craft into a wide-ranging spiral orbit, 3,000 feet above the surface of Venus, and adjusted his view screens for fine pickup. He was orbiting over a vast, dust-blown plain. The sky was a fantastic color, mottled blues and greens and an all-pervading pink, and the air was a dull gray. No sun at all penetrated the heavy shroud of vapor that hung around the planet. For 5 hours he scouted the plain, hoping to find some sign of Cavor's habitation. It was hopeless, he told himself. In 1,300 years the bitter winds of Venus would have destroyed any hint of Cavor's site, assuming the old man had reached Venus successfully. But grimly Alan continued to circle the area. Maybe Cavor had been forced to land elsewhere, he thought. Maybe he never got here. There were a million maybes. He computed his orbit and locked the ship in. Eyes pressed to the view screen, he peered downward, hoping against hope. This trip to Venus had been a wild gamble from the start. He wondered if Max Hawkes would have covered a bet on the success of his trip. Max had been infallible when it came to hunches. Well, Alan thought, now I've got a hunch. Help me one more time, Max, wherever you are. Lend me some of your luck. I need it, Max. He circled once more. The Venusian day would last for 3 weeks more, and there was no fear of darkness. But would he find anything? What's that? He leaped to the controls, switching off the autopilot, and broke out of orbit, going back for a return look. Had there been just the faintest metallic glint below, as of a spaceship jutting up from the sand? Yes, there was a ship down there, and a cave of some sort. Alan felt strangely calm. With confident fingers he punched out a landing orbit and brought his ship down in the middle of the barren Venusian desert. Chapter 18. Alan brought the Cavor down less than a mile away from the scene of the wreckage. It was the best he could do, computing the landing by guesswork, and climbed into his spacesuit. He passed through the airlock and out into the windswept desert. He felt just a little lightheaded. The gravity was only 0.8 of Earth norm, and besides that the air in his spacesuit, being perpetually renewed by the Brennerman rebreathing generator strapped to his back, was just a shade too rich in oxygen. In the back of his mind he realized he ought to adjust the oxygen flow, but before he brought himself to make the adjustment, the surplus took its effect. He began to hum, then to dance awkwardly over the sand. A moment later he was singing a wild space ballad that he thought he had forgotten years before. After 10 feet he tripped and went sprawling into the sand. He lay there, trickling the violet sands through the gloves of his spacesuit, feeling very light-headed and very foolish at the same time. But he was still sober enough to realize that he was in danger. It was an effort to reach over his shoulder and move the oxygen gauge back a notch. After a moment the flow leveled out and he felt his head beginning to clear. He was marching through a fantastic Baroque desert. Venus was a riot of colors, all in a minor key, muted greens and reds, an overbearing gray, a strange ghostly blue. The sky, or rather the cloud layer, dominated the atmosphere with its weird pinkness. It was a silent world, a dead world. In the distance he saw the wreckage of the ship. Beyond it the land began to rise, sloping imperceptibly up into a gentle hill with bizarre sculptured rock outcroppings here and there. He walked quickly. 15 minutes later he reached the ship. It stood upright, or rather, its skeleton did. The ship had not crashed. It had simply rotted away, the metal of its hide eaten by the sand-laden winds over the course of centuries. Nothing remained but a bare framework. He circled the ship, then entered the cave 100 feet away. He snapped on his light beam. In the darkness he saw a huddled skeleton far to the rear of the cave, a pile of corroded equipment, atmosphere generators, other tools now shapeless. Cavour had reached Venus safely, but he had never departed. To his astonishment, Alan found a sturdy volume lying under the pile of bones, a book, wrapped in metal plates. Somehow it had withstood the passage of centuries here in this quiet cave. Gently he unwrapped the book. The cover dropped off at his touch. He turned back the first 3 pages, which were blank. On the 4th, written in the now familiar crabbed hand, were the words, "The Journal of James Hudson Cavour, Volume 17, October 20, 2570. He had plenty of time during the 6-day return journey to read and reread Cavour's final words and to make photographic copies of the withered pages. The trip to Venus had been easy for old Cavour. He had landed precisely on schedule and established housekeeping for himself in the cave. But as his diary detailed it, he felt strength ebbing away with each passing day. He was past 80, no age for a man to come alone to a strange planet. There remained just minor finishing to be done on his pioneering ship, but he did not have the strength to do the work. Climbing the catwalk of the ship, soldering, testing now, with his opportunity before him, he could not attain his goal. He made several feeble attempts to finish the job, and on the last of them fell from his crude rigging and fractured his hip. He had managed to crawl back inside the cave, but, alone with no one to tend him, he knew he had nothing to hope for. It was impossible for him to complete his ship. All his dreams were ended. His equations and his blueprints would die with him. In his last day he came to a new realization. Nowhere had he left a complete record of the mechanics of his space warp generator, the key mechanism without which hyperspace drive was unattainable. So, racing against encroaching death, James Hudson Cavour turned to a new page in his diary, headed it in firm, forceful letters, "For those who follow after," and inked in a clear and concise explanation of his work. It was all there, Alan thought exultantly. The diagrams, the specifications, the equations. It would be possible to build the ship from Cavour's notes. The final page of his diary had evidently been Cavour's dying thoughts. In a handwriting increasingly ragged and untidy, Cavour had indited a paragraph forgiving the world for its scorn, hoping that some day mankind would indeed have easy access to the stars. The paragraph ended in mid-sentence. It was, thought Alan, a moving testament from a great human being. The days went by, and the green disk of Earth appeared in the view-screen. Late on the 6th day, the Cavour sliced into Earth's atmosphere, and Alan threw it into the landing orbit he had computed that afternoon. The spaceship swung in great spirals around Earth, drawing ever closer, and finally began to home in on the spaceport. Alan busied himself over the radio transmitter, getting landing clearance. He brought the ship down easily, checked out, and hurried to the nearest phone. He dialed Jesperson's number. The lawyer answered. "When did you get back?" "Just now," Alan said. "Just this minute." "Well, did you—" "Yes, I found it. I found it!" Oddly enough, he was in no hurry to leave Earth now. He was in possession of Cavour's notes, but he wanted to do a perfect job of reproducing them, of converting the scribbled notations into a ship. To his great despair, he discovered, when he first examined the Cavour notebook in detail, that much of the math was beyond his depth. That was only a temporary obstacle, though. He hired mathematicians. He hired physicists. He hired engineers. Through it all, he remained calm, impatient perhaps, but not overly so. The time had not yet come for him to leave Earth. All his striving would be dashed if he left too soon. The proud building rose 100 miles from York City, the Hawks Memorial Laboratory. There, the team of scientists Alan had gathered worked long and painstakingly, trying to reconstruct what old Cavour had written, experimenting, testing. Early in 3881, the first experimental Cavour generator was completed in the lab. Alan had been vacationing in Africa, but he was called back hurriedly by his lab director to supervise the testing. The generator was housed in a sturdy, windowless building far from the main labs. The forces being channeled were potent ones, and no chances were being taken. Alan himself threw the switch that first turned the space warp generator on, and the entire research team gathered by the closed-circuit video pickup to watch. The generator seemed to blur, to waver, to lose substance, and become unreal. It vanished. It remained gone 15 seconds, while 100 researchers held their breaths. Then it returned. It shorted half the power lines in the county. But Alan was grinning as the auxiliary feeders turned the lights in the lab on again. "Okay," he yelled. "It's a start, isn't it? We got the generator to vanish, and that's the toughest part of the battle. Let's get going on model number 2. By the end of the year, model number 2 was complete, and the tests this time were held under more carefully controlled circumstances. Again, success was only partial, but again Alan was not disappointed. He had worked out his timetable well. Premature success might only make matters more difficult for him. 3882 went by, and 3883. He was in his early 20s now, a tall, powerful figure, widely known all over Earth. With Jesperson's shrewd aid, he had pyramided Mac's original $1,000,000 credits into an imposing fortune, and much of it was being diverted to the hyperspace research. But Alan Donnell was not the figure of scorn James Hudson Cavour had been. No one laughed at him when he said that by 3885 hyperspace travel would be a reality. 3884 slipped by. Now the time was drawing near. Alan spent virtually all his hours at the research center, aiding the successive tests. On March 11th, 3885, the final test was accomplished satisfactorily. Alan's ship, the Cavour, had been completely remodeled to accommodate the new drive. Every test but one had been completed. The final test was that of actual performance. And here, despite the advice of his friends, Alan insisted that he would have to be the man who took the Cavour on her first journey to the stars. 9 years had passed almost to the week since a brash youngster named Alan Donnell had crossed the bridge from the Spacers' Enclave and hesitantly entered the bewildering complexity of York City. 9 years. He was 26 now, no boy anymore. He was the same age as Steve had been when he had been dragged unconscious to the Valhalla and taken aboard. And the Valhalla was still bound on its long journey to Procyon. 9 years had passed, but yet another remained before the giant starship would touch down on the planet of Procyon. But the Fitzgerald contraction had telescoped those 9 years into just a few months for the people of the Valhalla. Steve Donnell was still 26, and now Alan had caught him. The contraction had evened out. They were twins again. And the Cavour was ready to make its leap into hyperspace. Chapter 19. It was not difficult for Alan to get the route of the Valhalla, which had been recorded at Central Routing Registration. Every starship was required by law to register a detailed route chart before leaving, and these charts were filed at the Central Bureau. The reason was simple. A starship with a crippled drive was a deadly object. In case a starship's drive conked out, it would keep drifting along towards its destination, utterly helpless to turn, maneuver, or control its motion. And if any planets or suns happened to lie in its direct path, the only way a ship could alter its trajectory was to cut speed completely, and with the drive dead, there would be no way of picking it up again. The ship would continue to drift slowly out to the stars, while its crew died of old age. So the routes were registered, and in the event of drive trouble, it was thus possible for a rescue ship to locate the imperiled starship. Space is immense, and only with a carefully registered route could a ship be found. Starship routes were restricted information, but Alan had influence. He was easily able to persuade the routing registration people that his intentions were honorable, that he planned to overtake the Valhalla if they would only let him have the coordinates. A bit of minor legal jugglery was all that was needed to give him access to the data. It seemed there was an ancient regulation that said any member of a starship's crew was entitled by law to examine his ship's registered route if he wanted to. The rule was intended to apply to starmen who distrusted their captains and were fearful of being shipped off to some impossibly distant point. It said nothing at all about starmen who had been left behind and were planning to overtake their ships. But nothing prohibited Alan from getting the coordinates, so they gave them to him. The Cavour was ready for departure. Alan elbowed his way through the crowd of curious onlookers and clambered into the redesigned control chamber. He paused a moment, running his fingers over the shiny instrument panel with its new dials, strange levers, unfamiliar equipment. Overdrive compensator, fuel transmuter, distortion guide, bender index. Strange new names, but Alan realized they would be part of the vocabulary of all future spacemen. He began to work with the new controls, plotting his coordinates with extreme care, and checking them through 6 or 7 times. At last he was satisfied. He had computed a hyperdrive course that would loop him through space and bring him out in only a few days' time in the general vicinity of the Valhalla, which was buzzing serenely along at near the speed of light. That was practically a snail's pace compared with hyperdrive. The time for the test had come. He spoke briefly with his friends and assistants in the control tower, then he checked his figures through one last time and requested blast-off clearance. A moment later the countdown began, and he began setting up for departure. A tremor of anticipation shot through him as he prepared to blast off on the first hyperdrive voyage ever made. He was stepping out into the unknown, making the first use ever of a strange, perhaps dangerous means of travel. The drive would loop him out of the space-time continuum into where and back again, he hoped. He punched down the keys and sat back to wait for the automatic pilot to carry him out from Earth. Somewhere past the orbit of the moon, a gong told him that the Cavour drive was about to come into play. He held his breath. He felt a twisting sensation. He stared at the view screen. The stars had vanished. Earth, with all its memories of the last 9 years, was gone, taking with it Hawks, Jesperson, York City, the enclaves, everything. He floated in a featureless, dull, gray void, without stars, without worlds. So this is hyperspace, he thought. He felt tired, and he felt tense. He had reached hyperspace. That was half the struggle. It remained to see whether he would come out where he expected to come out, or whether he would come out at all. 4 days of boredom. 4 days of wishing that the time would come to leave hyperspace. And then the automatic pilot came to life. The Cavor generator thrummed and signaled that it had done its work and was shutting down. Alan held his breath. He felt the twisting sensation. The Cavor was leaving hyperdrive. Stars burst suddenly against the blackness of space. The view screen brightened. Alan shut his eyes a moment as he readjusted from the sight of the gray void to that of the starry reaches of normal space. He had returned. And below him, making its leisurely journey to Procyon, was the great golden-hulled bulk of the Valhalla, gleaming faintly in the black night of space. He reached for the controls of his ship radio. Minutes later, he heard a familiar voice, that of Chip Collier, the Valhalla's chief signal officer. "Starship Valhalla, picking up. We read you. Who is calling, please?" Alan smiled. "This is Alan Donald, Chip. How goes everything?" For a moment nothing came through the phones but astonished sputtering. Finally Collier said thickly, "Alan? What sort of gag is this? Where are you?" "Believe it or not, I'm hovering right above you in a small ship. Suppose you get my father on the wire, and we can discuss how I'll go about boarding you." 15 minutes later, the Cavor was grappled securely to the skin of the Valhalla, like a flea riding an elephant, and Alan was climbing in through the main airlock. It felt good to be aboard the big ship once again, after all these years. He shucked his spacesuit and stepped into the corridor. His father was standing there waiting for him. "Hello, Dad." Captain Donnell shook his head uncomprehendingly. "Alan, how did you... and you're so much older, too. The Cavor drive, Dad. I've had plenty of time to develop it. 9 good long years back on Earth, and for you it's only a couple of months since you blasted off." Another figure appeared in the corridor, Steve. He looked good. The last few months aboard the Valhalla had done their work. The unhealthy fat he had been carrying was gone. His eyes were bright and clear, his shoulders square. It was like looking into a mirror to see him, Alan thought. It hadn't been this way for a long time. "Alan, how did you..." Quickly, Alan explained. "So I couldn't reverse time," he finished. "I couldn't make you as young as I was, so I took the opposite tack and made myself as old as you were." He looked at his father. "The universe is going to change now. Earth won't be so overcrowded. And it means the end of the Enclave system and the Fitzgerald contraction." "We'll have to convert the Valhalla to the new drive," Captain Donnell said. He looked still stunned by Alan's sudden appearance. "Otherwise we'll never be able to meet the competition of the new ships." "There will be new ships, won't there? As soon as I return to Earth and tell them I've been successful, my men are ready to go into immediate production of hyperspace vessels. The universe is going to be full of them even before your ship reaches Procyon." He sensed now the full importance of what he had done. Now that there's practical transportation between stars, the galaxy will grow closer together, as close as the solar system now. Captain Donnell nodded. "And what are you planning to do now that you've dug up the Cavor drive?" "Me?" Alan took a deep breath. "I've got my own ship, Dad, and out there are Rigel and Deneb and Fomalhaut and a lot of other places I want to see." He was speaking quietly, calmly, but with an undercurrent of inner excitement. He had dreamed of this day for 9 years. "I'm going to take a grand tour of the universe, Dad. Everywhere. The hyperdrive can take me. But there's just one thing." "What's that?" Steve and the captain said virtually in the same moment. "I've been practically alone for the last 9 years. I don't want to make this trip by myself. I'm looking for a companion, a fellow explorer." He stared squarely at Steve. A slow grin spread over his brother's face. "You devil," Steve said. "You planned this too well. How could I possibly turn you down?" "Do you want to?" Alan asked. Steve chuckled. "Do you think I do?" Alan felt something twitching at his cuff. He looked down and saw a bluish-purple ball of fur sitting next to his shoe, studying him with a wry expression. "Rat! Of course. Is there room for a third passenger on this jaunt of yours?" "Application accepted," Alan said, warmth spreading over him. The long quest was over. He was back among the people he loved, and the galaxy was opening wide before him. A sky full of bright stars, growing brighter and closer by the moment, was beckoning to him. He saw the crewmen coming from their posts now. The rumor had flitted rapidly around the ship, it seemed. They were all there, Art Candon and Dan Kelleher, and a gaping Judy Collier, and Roger Bond, and all the rest of them. "You won't be leaving right away, will you?" the captain asked. "You can stay with us a while, just to see if you remember the place?" "Of course I will, Dad. There's no hurry now, but I'll have to go back to Earth first and let them know I've succeeded, so they can start production. And then—" "Deneb first," Steve said. "From there out to Spica and Altair." Grinning, Alan said, "More worlds are waiting than we can see in 10 lifetimes, Steve. But we'll give it a good try. We'll get out there." A multitude of stars thronged in the sky. He, Steve, and Rat, together at last, plunging from star to star, going everywhere, seeing everything. The little craft grappled to the Valhalla would be the magic wand that put the universe in their hands. In this moment of happiness he frowned an instant, thinking of a lean, pleasantly ugly man who had befriended him and who had died 9 years ago. This had been Max Hawk's ambition, to see the stars. But Max had never had the chance. "We'll do it for you, Max, Steve and I." He looked at Steve. He and his brother had so much to talk about. They would have to get to know each other all over again after the years that had gone by. "You know," Steve said, "when I woke up aboard the Valhalla and found out that you'd shanghaied me, I was madder than a hornet. I wanted to break you apart. But you were too far away." "You've got your chance now," Alan said. "Yeah, but now I don't want to." Steve laughed. Alan punched him good-naturedly. He felt good about life. He had found Steve again, and he had given the universe the faster-than-light drive. It didn't take much more than that to make a man happy. And now a new and longer quest was beginning for Alan and his brother. A quest that could have no end. A quest that would send them searching from world to world, out among the bright infinity of suns that lay waiting for them.